Again, welcome. We appreciate everybody coming to the webinar and being patient with us. Sorry about the glitch. But before we get started, let me take care of a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the ERIS website in the next few days at erisinfo.com. There will be time dedicated to the Q&A after the formal presentation. Please enter any questions you have in the Q&A section of the platform rather than the chat section, as we may not see them there. I'm Scott Davis, Senior Vice President, Industry Engagement for ERIS, and I am the host for today's presentation. As many of you may know, the EPA has amended the All Appropriate Inquiries to reference ASTM's E1527-21. The effective date is February 13th, 2023, and the previous standard will be phased out of the AAI rule after 1 year. Today, we are truly fortunate to have with us Julie Kilgore, E1527 Task Force Chair. Julie has over 25 years of experience in environmental assessments, investigation, remediation, and regulatory agency coordination. She is the president of Wasatch Environmental, an environmental science and engineering firm based out of Salt Lake City, Utah. And since 2000, Julie has chaired the task group responsible for revising the E1527 standard practice for environmental site assessments, the Phase 1 environmental site assessment process, and served on ASTM International Board of Directors. Julie was appointed by the EPA as one of the environmental professionals representatives of the Regulatory Negotiation Federal Advisory Committee to assist the EPA in developing the federal all appropriate inquiry regulation that adopted by reference the ASTM 1527 standard practice. Julie, over to you.
Great, thank you. And I really appreciate everybody's patience and that I'm seeing so many people come back on. Happy New Year, everyone. I'm glad to be here. We have finally reached this milestone that we've all been waiting for, and that's the reference from EPA for the 1527-21. So today I wanted to focus on the implementation of the 1527. For those of you who've been to any of my earlier programs, you'll know that there are very specific drivers that drive what the task group does every time we do a revision process. So I just want to touch on those briefly because they have direct bearing on the following slides and some of the questions that I often hear. We have first and foremost, our fundamental mandate as the 1527 task group is to address the requirements under CERCLA and all appropriate inquiries for defining consistent with what is good commercial and customary practice. We have a legislative and a regulatory mandate to conduct all appropriate inquiries consistent with good commercial and customary practice. So what is that? ASTM then uses this broad consensus-based method where we have users and producers, we have regulators, we have legal representation to help us develop a consistent process that's expected to result in a consistent deliverable. So I'm emphasizing certain phrases and terms here because they're very important to some of the following things that we'll be covering. Good commercial customary practice and an industry that conducts a consistent process for a consistent deliverable. Because it's those inconsistencies in the process and the inconsistencies in the quality, those are signals to the task group for areas where there can be some improvements in the standard. The other thing that we do as a task group is we watch where things go bad. There's a lot of litigation out there surrounding Phase 1 environmental site assessments. And we have a group of lawyers who watch this very closely. We have insurance companies, lenders, SBA, others who use Phase 1s a lot. And so they, again, bring information to the task group to inform us of where some of the troubles are. And those provide insight for areas, again, where the standard could be improved. So what is the ASTM process? The ASTM itself, they develop thousands of standards. We're just a little tiny piece in a much, much bigger wheel. And so there's a global requirement under the ASTM umbrella that all standards must be reviewed and revisited no later than once every 8 years. And it ensures market relevance, right? Let's make sure that what we're doing out there is current industry standards. So it's not just ours, it's all ASTM standards. So our task group most recently reconvened in February of 2018. We went through an extensive review, negotiation, and balloting process that was ultimately led to the revision, the revised standard that was published in November of 2021. Now, what happens under ASTM once that happens, we have a new updated standard out there, and the 1527, the former standard becomes a historical standard. And then for our particular standard, then ASTM headquarters submits notification to the Environmental Protection Agency that notifies the EPA that a new standard is available. And this is the same process that we follow for the 2247. The phase 1 environmental site assessment for forest land or rural properties. So we've done this several times since the 2005 all appropriate inquiries regulation for both the 1527 and for the forest land standard. Now, EPA does have a representative on our task group, has been very dedicated and has been a regular participant in our task group. So EPA knew and had provided some input and some feedback, and just to make sure that we stayed within the confines of the regulation and didn't get ourselves tripped up with suggesting or proposing language that might be inconsistent with the regulation. Because EPA's only role in this is to ensure that the 1527, if we're going to ask for them to reference the standard, we need to make sure that it complies with the regulation. That is the primary role for EPA. So what is their process? So EPA regulatory process for both 1527 and the 2247, once EPA is formally notified, again, they know it's coming and they've been participating all along, so it's not new news. Once EPA is formally notified by ASTM that a new updated standard is available for conducting all appropriate inquiries, then EPA begins this formal process of approving and referencing that standard as a tool, as one of the tools, the optional tool for complying with all appropriate inquiry regulation. Now, what EPA has done is it should pretty much be non-controversial. They're just referencing that the 1527 is compliant with the regulation and can be used to satisfy all appropriate inquiries. And when there's a non-controversial rule, then they can just issue a direct final rule that says, that's all we're doing. It's pretty simple. And if there's no comments, the rule will immediately go into effect. Well, that didn't happen this time. And it didn't happen in 2013. There were some comments that were submitted. And so then EPA, as again, part of their process, then they withdraw the direct final rule and they proceed with addressing the comments. The thing that I want to emphasize here is this is the normal process. And this is exactly the same process that took place in 1527 for 1527-13. I see so many things out there, email blasts and updates about how EPA has rejected the standard, or that's not what's happening here. This is a normal process. We've done it several times. What happened this time is exactly the same thing that happened last time. So it just takes time, right? It just takes time. And we knew it could take up to a year to get our reference from EPA. And it did, it took 13 months. So I wasn't off by too much. So now the availability, the 1527-21 was published in November of 2021. And it's available through ASTM. There's also a red line that's available, but I caution that you just be careful reading that because it looks pretty messy. We moved some things around and it's but you can get both of them. So as I mentioned, the 1527-13 is now a historical standard. It's still available as a historical standard, but the 1527 is now the current and active standard. Now that EPA has issued a final rule stating that the 1527-21 is compliant and they're referencing it, that does become effective February 13th. They are giving about a year phase-in period. If you've read the regulations, it says that EPA will remove its reference to 1527-13 after 1 year. And I'm putting this in quotes, right? It's to provide parties with adequate opportunity to complete your phase ones that are already in play at the time, and to give industry sufficient notice to become familiar with the updated standard. So that's where we are formally. The question that I get is, what do we do in the interim between now and February 13th? And what I've been seeing a lot of consultants do is they just continue to reference both standards until the final deadline, February 13th, where it is effective. But many have just already made the transition. And especially now that we have the notice from EPA that is announcing that we're compliant with the rules. So it looks like we're moving pretty quickly to the full-on adoption of 1527-21 in industry. We'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later, and any questions that you have on your own practices, and some thoughts I have also on implementation and those that are hanging on to use of the 2013. I want to be really careful about that, which is why I want to go over the key changes. Some of you have seen this before, but I'm going to touch on just the highlights and the things for users and producers to be looking for with their phase ones these days. So of course, the recognized environmental condition is the core of what we're getting to, right? What the heck is a REC? We changed up the definition a little bit. We didn't change the context or the content, just the structure of the recognized environmental condition. So when you're reading reports now moving forward, make sure that if you're writing them or if you're reviewing them, that the new definition is properly reflected in reports. So we have the presence of a hazardous substance or petroleum product due to a release to the environment. We know it's there. We see it's there. We have data that tells us that it's there. There is no question about it. Or the likely presence of a likely release of hazardous substance or petroleum product to the environment. We don't know that it's there, but the information that we're gathering is telling the environmental professional, if I were to go sample that, there's a pretty good chance we're going to find some contamination. That's the likely presence. And then, of course, the presence under the hazardous substance and petroleum products are there in a condition that poses a material threat of a release that has not yet happened, some mismanagement or something that could be prevented so that we could prevent a release to the environment in the future. Item 2 and item 3 are pretty straightforward. We know the hazardous substances, petroleum products, we know that they're there. Is that likely that we have a lot of conflict in industry about do we not? And so the standard now has some help with that likely term. There's a note that's been added to the recognized environmental condition that says the likely presence, but likely is that which is neither certain nor proved, but we're pretty sure it's going to be there if we go sample, right? And that's the whole reason we're doing historical research. We're looking for lines of evidence, different pieces of information that inform the environmental professional of the likelihood that we might have, that we're going to have contamination on the property. So we're hopeful that this is going to be helpful in getting, again, more consistency in that deliverable. Can the environmental consultant community more consistently get to the same endpoint with the same fact set? That's what we're working towards. Just once we have the REC and once we've had the release, of course, they get addressed, right? So there wasn't anything, again, in the content of the historical REC or the controlled REC that changed in this standard. Just again, trying to clean up the language and make it simpler and easier to follow. But in a nutshell, it really is no more complicated than you've had the past release affecting your property that has been addressed to an unrestricted use criteria. It once was there, it's all gone now, or gone enough that it meets unrestricted use criteria. The controlled REC, similar thing. We had the release affecting your property. It's been addressed to anything other than unrestricted use. What we were seeing in industry is we were seeing consultants misunderstanding that distinction between the historical recognized environmental condition and the controlled recognized environmental condition. And consultants were taking an example, a leaking underground storage tank site that had been cleaned up to a commercial standard and categorizing that as a historical wreck. Well, the commercial use criteria is the limitation. That's the control. You can't put a daycare there. If you have to fix a sewer line and dig through it, you're going to have to handle the material correctly. Whenever you start having those kind of conversations about what residual contamination is left behind, that's the control. And the point is to understand what the contamination is, where it is, and what we are responsible for managing it moving forward. So those are the distinctions we were trying to clear up so we can more consistently get those controlled situations into the conclusion section of the report, because buyers are buying property not realizing that they have these obligations in the event they need to change use of the property, or if they need to get into the dirt, or they need to get into the groundwater, and there's some residual contamination that needs to be managed correctly. And which brings us to this new definition that we have in the standard in 1527-21. Now, it's not a new concept. In 1527-13, when we developed that CREC definition, it says controls, for example, property use restrictions, activity and use limitations, institutional controls, engineering controls. And in some areas, those things are all the same thing, but not all. Right. So again, another confusion that we were seeing is that when there was a release that had been addressed, if there was no formal environmental covenant or deed restriction, or thou shalt lose their first child if they do anything wrong, then they would again categorize that over into a historical wreck because there was no control. But it's the limitation that in whatever form that it is. And there's a lot of variation in these risk-based closures and in these endpoints, and some are more formal controls, more formal AULs, some are not. There you meet a standard that was established by the agency. As long as it's commercial, it'll be fine. It's the environmental professional that has to understand what that data is telling us. So the task group then replaced that property use restriction that you see in the 2013 version and modified that slightly to be property use limitation, which is now defined, and it says a limitation or a restriction on current or future uses of the property in connection with the release, what residual contamination has been left behind. If there's anything you cannot do, that's your limitation. And that's what brings it down into the controlled recognized environmental condition. It's all fine, right? As long as we know what it is, where it is, and what we're supposed to be doing with it, managing it, moving forward. Another thing that you need to watch for in your reports that we tried to address in the standard, in your physical setting source reviews, remember when you're doing your agency file reviews to incorporate the physical setting source information that you're gathering as part of that process over in the physical setting source review information. What we were seeing after the 2013, where there was emphasis and more clarity on when to review agency file records for releases on the property and the adjoining properties. So what we were seeing more consistently than, it surprised me, the environmental professional would gather that information in part of their review, their agency file review, where they had boring logs, potentiometric surface maps, soil types, that sort of thing. But it didn't get incorporated over in the physical setting source information of the report. And where it became even more complicated was when the opinions about the other government database listings was based on the incorrect physical setting source information rather than the site-specific physical setting source information that was in another part of the report. So my suggestion to environmental consultants, in your templates, just add a line in there to remind you information obtained from our review of agency file records, just so you don't forget to connect those dots. The standard's clear that you don't have to independently go out and get that information. It's in the course of satisfying the other part of the standard where you're reviewing agency file records anyway to meet that part of the standard. Just remember to connect that back to the other part of your report. The historical research is where you're going to see the most change. In 2013, for the 2013 standard, we almost took it on back then, but the pain wasn't bad enough yet. It got worse, and the misses got worse. And those lower tier phase ones, where they were just hitting the white caps of information, doing just as absolute minimum research as possible, it got worse. And there were bigger misses, and there's more litigation, and we needed to be better about our historical research. The prior versions have always said, environmental professional, here's some standard historical sources, use these. Every site's going to be different. You pick which one is best. You're the smart ones. We're going to give you that flexibility. And maximizing that flexibility and then shoehorning that flexibility into this dive to the bottom pricing facilitated very, very weak historical research in a certain tier of the marketplace, and we had to stabilize that. So a couple of things that did not change. We go back to 1940 or first developed use, whichever is earlier, just like before. The intervals unchanged. There's no requirement to research in anything less than 5-year intervals, and in fact, if things haven't changed, you can go a bit longer if you need to. Standard historical sources for the most part did not change. One thing that we did do in this one, though, reflecting current use, is we pulled interviews up as one of the standard historical sources. What we heard from the community was, once you get out of urban and suburban areas, you're not going to find any of these other sources. Aerial photos and topos, that's it. But to get actual use information, you got to talk to somebody. And it's so important and so common that we pulled it up into one of the standard historical resources, and then moved chain of title down to the other sources, just because that one has always been acknowledged in the standard as one of the weaker historical sources to identify uses. And I want to emphasize how important it is to identify uses. And I'm going to show you a couple of ways that we tried to emphasize that for industry in this standard as well. So users and producers generally agreed that we needed some more consistency in the rigor of the historical research. Clear emphasis on property identification, that these properties, your property changes in size and configuration over time. And we were seeing some very significant misses because address numbers changed and the consultant didn't figure that out. Or the property boundaries changed, and what is now an adjoining property actually used to be part of your property. And that tank with an adjoining property address, it was actually on your property. So we had to just have a reminder. You got to be really clear when you're looking at historical and regulatory information. It might have a different address than today and might actually be on your property. So we needed to clarify a couple of things. We've always said that general types of use have been okay unless it's industrial, but that's been expanded this time to say, if your property is retail, yeah, we need more specific information. The other thing that we have put in the standard is that just telling me there's a building there, it's not sufficient. That's not a use. That's always been the case. If you look at your 2013 standard and all the priors, it's not just tell me I have a structure, identify historical use, because we got to find the uses of concern, and dry cleaners are a big deal right now. Some input that we got regarding dry cleaners that I want to share with all of us in this commercial real estate industry. Very important input. One of the state dry cleaner funds, when they were doing their baseline, launching their program, and this is public information, y'all can find it. As of 2016, 88% of their dry cleaner investigations for active dry cleaners exceeded action levels. 88% exceeded action levels. And these are the current and active dry cleaners. Consultant input in our task group and in other professional organizations for older dry cleaners, pre-regulation, that number is even higher. Small Business Administration tells us that if there's a dry cleaner that's ever been present, multimedia investigation is required. North Carolina Dry Cleaner Association tells us, and this was just last June, PCE continues to be the most prominent cleaning agent used at dry cleaners. This is going to be with us for a while. Many dry cleaner operations, again, from the same source, they haven't upgraded to the newer machines. It's very expensive. So there's still a lot of old dry cleaning machines that are being used out there. But the other primary key piece of input we got as a task group, EPA tells us that dry cleaners are currently the #1 source of new Superfund sites in this country. We need to find the dry cleaners. We need to do a better job of finding them. And we need to be more consistent as an industry in following up with investigation on these. When we talk about that likely presence of releases, these kind of numbers tell us that the likelihood of releases from dry cleaners is very high. So that was a lot of our emphasis. And there's other activities of concern, gas stations, service stations. We've always known that. We're making decisions differently about dry cleaners than we did 10, 15 years ago because of the industry input that we've received on that. So we got to find these things. Don't just tell me I have a building. Don't just tell me I have a shopping center. We got to find these things. All right, so what is the historical research itself that has changed? What we found from our industry outreach is that consultants consistent with good commercial customary practice, we're looking at least 4 of those standard historical sources whenever they were available for their site, for the most part. Aerials, topos, fire insurance maps, city directories. And it didn't matter if they were ordering the premium package from the database companies or if they were going down to the library and looking at the city directories and fire insurance maps themselves. However they were gathering historical information, most of the time consultants were looking at these four for the subject property, right? And so we say that in the standard now, and you need to account for at least these 4 standard historical sources in all of your reports. You did or did not review them. And if you didn't, that's fine. You just say why. Aerial photographs and interviews tell you that it's always been houses. Okay, that's fine. Say that in the report. Otherwise, we need to be looking at these four resources. And then we can look at the other additional resources, and many do. They shall be reviewed as needed to satisfy the objective. And remember, the objective is to identify historical uses. And then we can continue to use other historical sources as well. There's a big list, and that's a modifying list every time we do this as people are giving us information of what's been useful. But the more controversial one was historical research on the adjoining properties. And from this point forward, all consultants, and if you're writing or reviewing, you should have a section specific to historical research on adjoining properties. And what we found was that consultants were doing the same thing. If they were looking at these 4 historical sources for the subject property, they were checking them out for the adjoining properties as well. While they were there, while they're looking at maps, while they're looking at directories, for the most part, they were looking at all of these sources for the adjoining properties as well. Same thing, the standard says, if reviewed for the subject property and not for the adjoining property, just say why. And there's valid reasons that we've heard. And you just explain, you had a gas station maybe next door, but it's down the hillside, or whatever the reason is. Just if you didn't review additional historical resources for an adjoining property, you just say why. And then again, we have the other sources available to us. If we haven't achieved the objective, what were the uses? The bigger controversy really was about city directories. If you're looking at maps, it's all pretty clear, but the city directories. And I just want to emphasize that we were seeing some inconsistency in how this was being interpreted in the 2013 standard, where we were just talking about the surrounding property and there wasn't anything specific about adjoining properties. But I want to highlight that the standard has said for a very long time, some factors to include when you're considering your historical resource research for surrounding areas. For example, reviewing the local city directories for more than a few streets that surround the site is typically too time consuming for more than a few streets. We always figured you were looking next door, right? So just needed some consistency, and most people were. And then the surrounding area, we've left it pretty much substantially unchanged and leaving some of the same language that's always been there. Another one that we heard a lot about that we had to figure out was the AUL, activity and use limitation, and lien search. And it wasn't really about the liens, because if you've got a multi-million-dollar lien on your property, everyone's gonna know that. What we found out was happening is that some of these environmental covenants were getting missed. And so I'm just going to highlight this section, and I'm borrowing the slide from the ASTM training deck here. In section 6.2 of the new standard, we're saying you can still rely on title and insurance documentation. This has always been a user responsibility to review their title reports, because they're getting a title report. They don't need environmental professionals to do something that is not their bailiwick. So that's fine. Keep using your title reports. The user has to inform the environmental professional if the title report identified environmental liens or AULs. That's fine. Unless expressly added as a change in the scope to the phase one, the EP has never been responsible for reviewing land title records for environmental liens and AULs. All that being said, there was a market that developed to sell environmental professionals these AUL and land title record searches. They've been very successful. And they haven't been being done correctly because of some interpretation about in the language. So for whatever reason, we had to fix it. We had to fix it. So now it says only for those third-party vendors who are offering environmental liens and AUL searches, they can't just look at current owner information. They have to go back and pick up these environmental covenants that were recorded 1, 2, 4 property owners ago. Well, how to express that was just to tie it to CERCLA. So if you're ordering these third-party vendors, environmental lien and AUL, activity and use limitation searches, they have to go back to 1980 to pick up those old environmental covenants. Otherwise, they're not conforming with the standard or the regulation. So that's good. But that only matters, like I said, this is a user responsibility. This only matters if you're an environmental professional who's ordering these third-party vendors. So as a reviewer of these reports, you'll want to watch and make sure that you look at your title reports. That's what you need to make sure you do. We do have a definition of significant data gap that's going to help us a lot. We've always struggled with what to do with these significant data gaps. What's a significant data gap? What do I do with this significant data gap? So the first thing we did, we now have a definition for what that is, right? A significant data gap is a hole that is so big in your research that it's affecting your ability to identify recs. There's some information out there that you cannot get. Snow on the ground, you can't get the agency file records, client confidentiality, they won't let you talk to anybody, whatever. In the context of all the other information that you're gathering, but if you could, at the end of your process, you still have this significant data gap affecting your ability to identify recs. That's the significant data gap. We all have data gaps. In all our reports, we have data gaps, but it's got to be a big hole to be a significant data gap. So you must have a section in your report specific to significant data gaps. We did or did not have significant data gaps. And part of the reason that that matters is because we've made some changes in the deliverable. So some things in your reports. First of all, we came up, agreed that we're going to call it the subject property. It was driving users crazy because every consultant was calling the site a different thing. So to be consistent with the standard, we're all calling them the subject property. The users wanted more robust discussion on the significant data gaps and how those are affecting your opinion. Who did you talk to? How did you try to address the data gap? And how is this affecting your opinion? But the other thing, you have to change your templates to make sure that your conclusions include recognized environmental conditions, controlled recognized environmental conditions, and significant data gaps, because your conclusions are conditional on a significant data gap that the users don't want to have to go try to find, that's buried up on page 6 of your report. If you have a significant data gap affecting your opinion, you need to put it in the conclusion section of your report. There's another one that surprised me. Users, this was a user request, because they get these phase ones that aren't even worth the electronic submittal that they put them in, and they have no pictures, they have no maps. And then when they go back to the consultant to say, I need pictures and show me where I am on planet Earth, and the consultant will come back and say, that's not required by the standard. I didn't realize we needed to tell people this, but now the standard says that your report shall include photographs and a site map. Photographs representing de minimis conditions, your recognized environmental conditions. I've already heard some concerns about, well, how do I have a photograph of the risk of releases from an old gas station? Well, an aerial photograph has a camera right underneath it taking a picture of that old gas station. There's your photograph. So got to have that information in there. Show me pictures. A lot of questions about the PFAS and PFOS, and it's addressed in emerging contaminants section. It's considered a non-scope consideration right now because it is not listed as a CERCLA hazardous substance. That is changing, but I just want to emphasize that there is nothing in the standard that has, or AAI, that has ever required you to identify a specific contaminant, right? This is kind of a protection for you, for buyers and for consultants. We don't know where all this is coming from yet. We don't understand this yet, but it's not yet regulated as a CERCLA hazardous substance. So, but know your states, right? There's a section in the standard up in section 1 about a conversation users and consultants have to have if you want to have an evaluation of the likelihood of this particular contaminant. You need to have that conversation up front. Otherwise, it's a non-scope consideration. And then just some final thoughts on the changes to 1527. So the latest revisions reflect input from across the country from users and producers, and it represents good commercial customary practice. Okay. So many of the changes that were incorporated were requested by some very active user groups that were seeking better consistency in the phase 1 environmental site assessment and the process and the deliverables. Some of your clients have been unhappy. They brought that to the task group. So environmental professionals that were producing quality deliverables are likely to see very little substantive change in the process, right? Maybe the structure in your reports and how you're articulating, and maybe some more consistency in how you're going about the assessment. But again, this isn't just good ideas we came up with because we wanted people to do this. This is what your peers are saying they do. So we want to be consistent with that. Please read the standard. If you're doing phase 1s, please read the standard. I get a lot of questions, and I can most of the time answer those questions by taking someone right back to a specific section in the standard. So please read the standard and then compare that to the work that you're doing right now. I would also suggest taking an ASTM phase 1 class, and I want to emphasize a phase 1 ASTM class that is offered by ASTM. I've seen some other courses out there, and I've seen some of the material and some of the videos and some of the other things that are out there as instructional that are just wrong. They're just wrong. So I would encourage, if you haven't been in one in a while, or if you're new to the industry, read the standard, take a class, and let's try as a community to get more consistent in what we're putting out there. I'll turn this over to Scott if we have questions, comments, anything else that I can answer. My contact information is at the end of this, and happy to answer questions. Scott, back to you.
Yeah. Actually, we have several questions, so we'll get started on this. We'll try to answer as many as we can before the time runs out. But
okay.
First question: can we reference the new ASTM E1527 -21 on a new phase 1?
Yeah, and I've been encouraging people to do that even before this. But now that we have the official reference stated by EPA, and you can choose to do a couple of things. One of the things that I've recommended, if you want to be like certain to wait until February 13th, you can still reference the prior 1527-13, but also just add a little note that says, and this assessment incorporates the updated procedures and definitions set forth in 1527-21. And I've seen that to be very successful, but yeah, I would encourage folks, let's get rolling. Let's incorporate the new stuff.
Okay. The next would be, does likely mean a 50% or more chance?
That's a really good
Test of-
no, that's a really good question. I'm sorry, finish the question.
No, it says this is the test that the courts use on other opinions.
It depends on the court, and it depends on what reference they're looking at. We had a lot of that discussion, and we intentionally did not put a number on it.
Okay. Now this question is referring to HREC definition and about the change of the word from or to and, from 1527-13 to and in 21.
Or and.
Yeah, from or to and
Where in the sentence?
yes. And they're referring to, based on this wording change, a site that is closed by a regulatory agency with no restrictions, but did not achieve unrestricted use standards would no longer be an HREC. Is that correct?
It never was. It never was. They have to reach unrestricted use criteria. And one of the things that we did in the early one was, I think we said like unrestricted or residential, something like that. But we learned from some of the regulatory communities that there actually could be a restricted residential use. So we just had to take that out. It's always been intended to say, you once had your contamination and now it's gone. There are no restrictions on use of the property at all. So we just needed to clarify that.
Okay. Next question, can you please opine on whether or not a new UST is a REC?
Let me just put it this way. Things are not RECs. A UST is not a REC. A drum is not a REC. A dry cleaner is not a REC. Things are not RECs. Tie your opinion to the likelihood of releases. So the question you have to answer as an environmental professional is the likelihood of a release from a new underground storage tank. And that's going to be your professional judgment.
Next question, a UST that was removed and found, it's the same. Can you please explain changes to title search requirements now required back to 1980 to present?
Sure. So again, title reports that are issued by a title company for the purposes of a property transaction that everybody gets, and every buyer is going to get one of those. Nothing changes there. Those are acceptable. Those have always been acceptable. And that's what the standard has always wanted the users to review. The changes are in these third-party vendor providers that are selling you these environmental lien and selling consultants, users and producers, the environmental lien and AUL searches, and they were only looking at current owner information. And the reason that disconnect was happening is because what we had said in the standard was to review for environmental liens and activity and use limitations currently affecting the property. Because what we didn't want is for buyers to have to go chasing down environmental liens and things that have been satisfied, right? So we tried to make it clear, currently affecting title. Well, the way some of these vendors were interpreting that is that the requirement was to review current owner information only. And that's not what we meant. So for those vendors who are selling you something outside of what a buyer is already getting for their title reports, if you choose to do that, or you're contracted to go do that which is not required of you by the standard, you have to make sure that vendor is doing it appropriately and going back far enough that they would pick up those environmental covenants, because that's what they were missing.
The next question is EPA sunsetting its acceptance of the prior standard E1527-13 1 year after the new standards effective date of February 13, 2024, or 1 year after the publication date of the final rule, December 15,
You know,
2023?
and that's a good question. And I looked at that myself, trying to, from the date of publication, told me the date of like when when it was published. But some are interpreting it as when it becomes effective. So I don't honestly know exactly the answer to that question, because I tried to find it myself. Hopefully, we're all going to be transitioned over before that anyway. So I didn't spend a lot of time trying to figure it out. I can reach out to Patricia though and ask her what the intention is.
Okay. Can you further explain what is meant by including physical setting source information obtained from agency file reviews?
Yeah, tell me the depth of groundwater and the groundwater flow direction that you found in those groundwater monitoring reports.
Okay. For comparison, what is the rate of exceedance for gas stations?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that question. I personally do not have that data. We know it's high just from our experience, right? From especially old gas stations. And don't forget the service. I see that happen a lot when I review reports. Everybody is focused on the great big bugaboo of underground storage tanks, but they forget the service. So we've just as an industry, I think we see that the risk from those gas stations, the old gas stations especially, are pretty high.
Yeah.
But I don't have a number for you, not like we did the dry cleaners.
Okay, if the user doesn't provide the lien and title information and don't authorize it in a scope of work, does this mean they aren't covered under CERCLA?
Well, that's a legal question, and that's something they're going to have to defend. What you as the environmental professional are responsible for is asking the question. If they don't answer the question, did they have a title report and did they review it for AULs and environmental liens? You, as the environmental professional, you ask the question. If the user does not answer the question, you deal with that as a data gap, and then you just have to opine on the likelihood that it's a significant data gap. And if you've never had EPA on your site, and if you've never had any release and there's never been any action, it would likely not be a significant data gap, but you're going to have to judge that one.
Okay, can you go into more detail regarding historical research when property boundaries change through time, and how you address that when there aren't FIMs or similar historical resource that identifies address property boundary changes?
Yep, it happens all the time on most of our properties. It's going to happen. You have to be really clear on your boundary. What is your current subject property boundaries? That's defined by your user, right? That is your subject property. Then as you're evaluating your historical resources, you got to figure out if those things that you are identifying were on your subject property or not on your subject property. And that can be tough to figure out sometimes. Takes a bit of work.
Now, this is somewhat related. What about adjacent properties in a situation where today your adjacent property is I-10 that's 20 lanes wide?
Adjoining properties, we've got to use the right words. Adjoining properties. Again, another challenge that we talked about at length as a task group. So currently your adjoining property, by definition of adjoining property, would be across that 10-lane freeway. But for historical purposes, what was under that freeway and next to your property boundary was historically your adjoining property. And those are exactly the problems that we were finding that people were missing when they were just hitting the white caps of their historical research.
Is a significant data gap a wreck?
No, significant data wreck is presence or likely presence of a release. A significant data gap is I've got some information that is informing me, that is raising my level of concern about something I can't figure out. I've got an industrial building next door and I don't know what it is or what it ever was. Or I have a commercial, I have a retail strip right next to my building or on my building, and we've checked everything we can check and we can't tell if there was ever a dry cleaner, right? Something raises that data gap to some level that concerns you. And I think how this is going to help us is that we can have our report say, we have no wrecks or we have wrecks. but there's this significant data gap here that is affecting my ability to identify recognized environmental conditions. And so your condition to your conclusion can be incorporated into your conclusions so that you can opine and conclude about what you know or what your lines of evidence are telling you. But that's conditional on this really big thing you don't know because you couldn't get in the building or whatever the challenge was.
So question is, are third-party vendors going back to 1980 for AULs?
You know what? I was really hoping when this standard came out, that's what was going to happen. But you know what? I have been hearing that's not what's happening. They're offering consultants two things. So I hope that this will solve the problem. But
Well, they got to be willing to pay for it.
well, but so there's my question is why buy something that doesn't satisfy the standard or the regulation? That I don't, and let the users do what the users are obligated to do. We get their title reports. That's what they're all getting them. So I don't understand how we wound up with this problem to begin with.
Yeah. And this will be the last question. We have a lot more, and I'll get to those. But can the history for the site and adjoining and surrounding area all be discussed together, or do you recommend separate sections?
Ooh, I suppose that would depend on how complicated it is, because I would. Now, this is just the opinion according to Julie. In my brain, you've got the boundaries of your subject property, and you need to be really specific about what's going on in your, unless it's all just an ag field or all the same thing, which happens sometimes, right? Sometimes it's all just part of the same farm, but it makes sense that they should be broken out.
Okay. Look, there's a lot of great questions. There's quite a bit. And Julie has agreed to answer all these. And what we'll do is get that from her and then make sure that you guys get notice of where you can review those questions, the answer to those questions when we're done. But
sometimes it takes me a while. It might take me a little bit to get to it, but I'll try to do that. Yeah, I want to answer folks' questions and any other further discussion or concerns or anything that you have. We need to all be moving forward together.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today's presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everybody, being so patient with the glitches we had early on.
Yeah,
we had a lot of people come back, and I really appreciate that.
You bet. To get more information about ASTM E1527 updates or environmental due diligence, please visit ERIS Info Hub on erisinfo.com, which contains curated articles, podcasts, and past webinars on this topic. Additionally, you can register for our next webinar on Info Hub, scheduled for next Tuesday, January 10th at 12 p.m. Central, about the economic outlook for commercial real estate for 2023 with Ryan Servino, JLL's chief economist. Then on Wednesday, January 18th, we will host a virtual demo of our new report authoring platform called Scriva. The links for both webinars are in the chat box, but also can be found on our website homepage on erisinfo.com. Please note this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on our ERIS website in the next few days. So on behalf of ERIS and our audience, I would like to give a big thank you to you, Julie, for sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience with us today. And to our audience, we want to thank you for your attention during this past hour and your patience with us. We appreciate it. Please enjoy the rest of your day.